A woman boarded a private jet in silence. No entourage, no designer luggage. Just a hoodie, worn sneakers, and $1 billion secret. Moments later, she was slapped across the face by a flight attendant who assumed she didn't belong. But what happened next flipped the entire cabin upside down. This wasn't just about race respect or power. It was about a reckoning that began 40,000 feet in the air. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. It was supposed to be just another smooth departure from Van Nuys Airport private jets, humming softly in the California morning light flight attendants, checking manifests with professional ease, and a Gulfstream G700 gleaming quietly on the runway like a promise of exclusivity. The kind of scene where power often moves silently, unnoticed. But not that day. Amira Langston wasn't late. She didn't make a scene. She didn't show up in a limousine flanked by bodyguards or burdened by designer luggage. She simply walked onto the tarmac with a backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in hand, and a pair of black Nikes that had clearly seen more sidewalks than red carpets. Her hoodie was slightly wrinkled, her afro pulled into a high puff. She looked like a woman who belonged anywhere but not to everyone. Inside the cabin, Jenna Reed, lead flight attendant with 12 years of experience and a name that carried weight in private aviation circles, noticed her immediately through the oval window. She stiffened before Amira had even touched the first step of the aircraft. "Who's that?" she muttered to the co-pilot. He shrugged. "She's not on my sheet." The moment Amira stepped inside the plane, it was as if an invisible thread snapped. "Excuse me," Jenna said with a firm, practiced voice as she blocked the aisle. "This is a private charter. I'm going to have to ask you to wait outside." Amira didn't look up from her phone. "I'm aware." "No, I don't think you are," Jenna replied, lips tight. "This flight is for Meridian Altair Holdings. Confidential client. There's no record of another passenger boarding." Amira slipped her phone into her pocket, then met Jenna's eyes. "I am the client." There it was, a sentence that should have ended the interaction, but instead it detonated something deeper. Jenna blinked. Once, twice. Then smiled a customer service smile tight at the corners. "I'll need to see identification. This is a security-sensitive charter. I'm sure you understand." From the back of the cabin, a younger crew member, Luis, fresh from a regional airline, peeked around the galley. "Jenna," he called gently. "She's on the manifest, top line. Dr. Amira Langston?" Jenna's smile evaporated, but her disbelief remained. "She can't be." "Are you sure that's not a clerical error?" Amira moved past her quietly and took a seat near the window. She didn't argue. She didn't gloat. She just existed. Calm, assured like a woman who had sat in that seat before many times. But Jenna couldn't sit with it. She watched Amira place her bag in the overhead compartment, adjust her seat, and resume reading something on her phone. That kind of quiet confidence, that refusal to seek validation, it agitated something in Jenna she didn't know she carried. She approached again. This time, her tone colder. "Ma'am, I'm asking one more time. Identification, or we'll have to contact ground operations." Amira glanced up. Why am I being asked to verify my identity again after your colleague already confirmed it? Because something isn't adding up, Jenna replied. It is for you. You just don't like the math. The air in the cabin tightened. A few heads turned, executives in suits, a tech entrepreneur in headphones, none of them interfering, all pretending they weren't listening. Jenna moved closer. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't a bus stop. You don't just show up in sweats and claim a jet. And then in a moment that would define the day and all the days that followed, Jenna reached for Amira's arm. It wasn't violent, but it was forceful, authoritative, uninvited. Amira stood, slowly, taller than Jenna by a few inches. Don't touch me. Jenna didn't back down. Then show me who you are. The slap came out of nowhere. Not from Amira, but from Jenna. One sharp motion, the sound a flat echo that didn't belong on soft leather and luxury air. It wasn't rage. It was control. Or so Jenna thought. Time stopped. Amira didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She stood hand to her cheek as silence crushed the cabin like cabin pressure dropping mid-flight. Luis dropped the tray of Perrier he was holding. One of the execs dropped his newspaper. Jenna stepped back, breathing hard, suddenly unsure why she had done it. She wasn't cooperating, she said weakly. She owns the plane. Luis said, his voice cracked but steady. Dr. Amira Langston, CEO of Langston Dynamics. She's the majority shareholder in Meridian Altair. Jenna froze. Luis kept going, not cruelly, but plainly the way truth sounds, when it no longer needs to be defended. She's the reason this jet exists, and you just put your hands on her. Amira sat down again. She didn't ask for the pilot. She didn't reach for a lawyer. She didn't tweet. She simply said, "Let's fly." Jenna looked around, but no one came to her aid. Not the co-pilot, not the passengers, not even the junior staff. Power had shifted. Quietly. Permanently. But Amira didn't need to announce it. She just wore it, in silence. And as the jet rose into the morning sky, one woman carried a bruise that wasn't physical, but would change everything she thought she knew about identity power and who really belongs in first class. The storm had begun. And not a single cloud had formed yet. The jet sliced through the air at 45,000 feet, but inside the cabin, there was only stillness, the kind that doesn't come from comfort, but from consequence. Jenna Reed sat rigid in her jump seat, hands clenched tightly in her lap, the sting of her own choices throbbing louder than the gentle hum of the engines. She'd expected turbulence in the air, not in her world. And now that turbulence had a name, Dr. Amira Langston. Amira wasn't staring out the window in quiet retreat. She wasn't sulking or rehearsing revenge. She was reading, annotating a technical brief with a mechanical pencil, the same way she had on every other flight this year. There was no dramatics, no tension in her brow, just a practiced focus that didn't waver, even in the wake of humiliation. Jenna watched her from across the aisle, trying to make sense of what she had done. The woman she had just assaulted wasn't a stranger. She was the future of aerospace innovation, a figure whose quiet rise had been so calculated and careful that few even realized she now controlled the very company that employed them all. Amira Langston had earned her first patent at 23, an adaptive guidance system for private jets designed while she was still in grad school at MIT. By 28, she had co-founded Ascension Dynamics, a tech firm that built lightweight propulsion units for long-range drones. The industry dismissed her at first. Too young, too soft-spoken, too black, until the contracts started rolling in. First with NASA, then DARPA. then 3 Fortune 100 aerospace conglomerates. But Amira hadn't stopped at invention. She was a builder, not just of machines, but of systems. She created companies not to sell them, but to shape them. And when she quietly acquired a controlling interest in Meridian Altair Holdings, she did so not for prestige, but for something deeper, something strategic. She was rewriting the rules from the inside. And yet, none of that had been enough to stop Jenna from seeing only the hoodie, the sneakers, the skin. Jenna now sat steeped in a realization so heavy, it felt like gravity itself had turned against her. Back in her seat, Amira flipped a page, then paused. She pulled out her phone, not to call her lawyers or post a statement, but to open a note she'd been drafting for weeks. It was a document titled Operational Recalibration Culture and Accountability. She added a line beneath the heading, "Bias is not always loud. Sometimes it whispers protocol in your ear and calls it professionalism." Luis approached quietly, offering her tea. She accepted with a nod. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I'm not the one who should be asked that," she replied. Luis nodded, then hesitated. "I just want you to know, not all of us would have acted like that." "I know," Amira said, her voice calm. "But that's not the point, is it?" He shook his head. "No, it's not." She sipped the tea, eyes distant. "The point is, this happens even when you own the sky." At the back of the plane, Captain Howard Beckett was on the line with HQ. His voice was low-clipped and serious. "Yes, confirmed. Passenger is Dr. Amira Langston?" "Yes, the same." It was unprovoked. "Yes, recorded on interior cam. I'd advise the legal team to be ready." "No, she hasn't filed anything yet." "But she doesn't need to. She's already moving." Meanwhile, Jenna sat frozen. Her mind replayed every moment, her assumptions, the smirk she couldn't hide, the slap. She had built a career out of predicting people, reading micro-expressions, responding with flawless etiquette. But none of it had prepared her for what it meant to misread power. When Amira finally looked up again, her expression wasn't angry. It wasn't smug. It was resolved. She stood and walked to the rear of the plane, asking to use the conference room. The captain opened the door without a word. Inside, Amira sat down and opened a separate file on her tablet. It was her proposal for a company-wide cultural audit, something she'd already been developing, but had hesitated to launch. Not anymore. Now she would start with training, then policies, then leadership. What happened on that flight wouldn't be reduced to a scandal or a headline. It would be a turning point. She drafted an internal memo. Effective immediately, all Meridian Altair flight personnel will undergo implicit bias retraining and policy restructuring sessions. Disciplinary reviews will be conducted by a third-party oversight committee. We do not protect ignorance. We correct it. Back outside, the passengers whispered. Some had seen the slap. Others had only felt the shift in energy. But by now, they all knew the truth. And they all understood the lesson. Power doesn't always dress in tailored suits or announce itself with headlines. Sometimes it walks in quietly, claims a seat, and says nothing because it doesn't need to. Jenna couldn't stay silent any longer. She approached the conference room with shaking hands. "Dr. Langston," she asked, voice small. Amira looked up. I want to apologize. Truly, I didn't know who you were." Amira's eyes didn't soften. "That's exactly the problem." Jenna swallowed hard. "I wasn't thinking." No, Amira interrupted. "You were thinking exactly how you were taught to. That's the issue. You saw my presence as a threat, not my behavior, not my actions. My presence. Jenna's shoulders slumped. I don't know how to fix it. Amira stood not hostile but firm. You don't fix it with words. You fix it by learning, by unlearning, by listening, and by getting out of your own way. Jenna nodded slowly, tears pooling, but not falling. I want to try. Amira didn't offer comfort, but she offered direction. Then start by stepping aside. There's work to be done. Back in her seat, Amira pressed send on the memo. The engines continued to hum. The sky outside was still blue, but something had shifted, and the most powerful woman on board didn't need a uniform or a name tag to lead. She just needed to be seen. The cabin was quiet, eerily so. No clinking glasses, no polite chatter. Just the soft ambient hum of the jet's engines as it cruised above the clouds suspended between two coasts and two very different versions of truth. At 40,000 feet distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional, professional, even existential. And every passenger could feel it. Dr. Amira Langston sat alone near the front, her seat reclined just slightly, her gaze fixed not on the cabin, but on something far more distant than the horizon. To an outsider, she may have seemed detached, but she wasn't escaping. She was recalibrating quietly, methodically, and with the clarity of someone who had nothing left to prove, but everything to change. Across the aisle, Jenna Reed sat stiffly. Her hands were tucked beneath her thighs, as if by suppressing her movement, she could suppress the memory. But the memory was already carved into the skin of the moment, the echo of her own voice, the snap of judgment, the sharp sting of a slap she would never be able to justify. Not to HR, not to Amira, not even to herself. It wasn't just the physical act that haunted her. It was the silence that followed. Not the kind of silence that comes after conflict, but the kind that reveals something deeper: exposure. The realization that she had not only crossed a line, but that she had been standing on the wrong side of it all along. Tony, the junior flight attendant, moved through the cabin quietly, offering water with a kind of reverence, like he didn't want to disturb the air. When he reached Amira's seat, she looked up briefly and gave a nod of appreciation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The unspoken acknowledgement between them said enough. You saw me. That's rare. Jenna watched it happen, that quiet exchange, and felt her stomach churn. She wasn't used to being irrelevant. In most spaces, she had the confidence of experience of seniority. But none of that could protect her now. The uniform no longer gave her authority. It only reminded her how wrong she had been to believe it ever should have. The pilot's voice came over the intercom with the usual monotone update. Weather in New York was fair descent, would begin in just over an hour. But it felt like background noise to a different kind of descent happening inside the aircraft. One that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with awareness. Amira glanced at the tablet in her lap. A message had come in from her legal team, ready to move on internal protocol. She read it twice, then minimized the screen. Not yet. There was still something more important to be done. She reached for the small leather notebook beside her, the one she kept for moments that couldn't be typed. With slow, deliberate strokes, she wrote a single sentence. What do we teach in silence that words will never unlearn? She didn't know if it was a thought, a thesis, or a warning. Maybe all three. In the galley, Jenna tried to steady her breath. She had rehearsed apologies in her head for the last hour, but none of them felt right. Every version started with excuses: I didn't mean to. I was following procedure. You caught me off guard, and none of them erased the image of her hand, raised in impulse and lowered in disgrace. She stood finally and walked toward Amira. Each step felt like walking into the courtroom of her own conscience. She stopped just short of Amira's seat and cleared her throat. "Dr. Langston," she said, voice tight. "Do you have a moment?" Amira looked up. There was no warmth in her eyes. No anger either. Just neutrality. The kind that makes you aware you are no longer in control of the moment. "I'm listening," Amira said. Jenna shifted. "I owe you an apology. A real one. I didn't just misjudge you. I disrespected you. I acted out of ignorance. Out of," she hesitated, "habit." Amira waited. Silence again. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness," Jenna added. "I'm asking for direction. Because I don't want to stay who I was an hour ago." Amira's gaze held hers for a long beat. "Then you'll need to do something that's harder than apologizing," she said softly. "You'll have to change. And change," she added, "is quiet work. It doesn't need spotlights. It needs consistency." Jenna nodded slowly. "I understand." "No, you don't," Amira replied. "Not yet, but maybe you will." She didn't dismiss her. She didn't offer a pardon, but she had left the door unlocked. And for Jenna, that was more grace than she deserved. The rest of the flight passed with the kind of stillness that invites reflection. No more apologies. No more glances. Just the soft thrum of a cabin full of people realizing they'd been present for something that might not make the news, but would change them just the same. When the captain announced final descent, Amira put away her notebook and folder. Jenna returned to her jump seat, eyes ahead, no longer thinking about how to explain her actions to her supervisor, but how to live differently after the landing gear touched down. At 40,000 feet, no one had raised their voice. No lawsuit had been filed. No cameras had captured the moment. But a reckoning had begun. Not with drama, but with clarity. And sometimes that's all it takes. The wheels touched down on the tarmac at JFK with a soft thud, as if the aircraft itself knew to land gently under the weight of what had happened above the clouds. The jet taxied slowly to a private terminal, its engines humming like a quiet heartbeat, trying to mask the tension that had not yet found release. Outside, a black SUV waited with tinted windows and a discreet driver already at attention. Inside the jet, no one moved immediately, not out of confusion, but out of restraint. Everyone knew something had shifted. Dr. Amira Langston stood first, not with urgency, but with precision. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, like each gesture had been practiced in silence. She slid her leather folder back into her bag, pulled her hoodie sleeve straight, and stepped into the aisle without acknowledging anyone else. Power didn't need volume. It only needed certainty. Behind her, Jenna Reed remained buckled in her jump seat, her body stiff, her throat dry. She watched as Amira approached the door and paused not to wait, but to deliver a final silence. Jenna thought the moment might pass, like vapor, that Amira would simply disembark and leave her with nothing but shame and paperwork. But then, just as Amira reached the cabin exit, she turned not sharply, but with intent. Her eyes met Jenna's and held them. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice steady low. "But your bigger mistake was believing you wouldn't have to answer for it." Jenna opened her mouth, but Amira raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to end the exchange. Then she stepped off the plane into the cool New York air, leaving behind a woman who had mistaken uniform for authority and silence for insignificance. The SUV door closed softly. No slams. No theatrics. Inside, Amira's team waited a pair of legal aides and her executive assistant, Mariah, who handed her a fresh binder without speaking. Amira opened it, flipped to the tab labeled Incident Response, and tapped her pen once before speaking. Full internal review, she said, effective immediately. Jenna Reed is to be relieved of duty pending retraining. Mariah nodded, already typing. Do we inform Meridian PR? No public statement, Amira replied. This is not about image. It's about integrity. Behind her, the jet sat still, sunlight gleaming against its polished hull. But the cabin inside remained frozen in a different kind of stillness. Captain Drew Carlton emerged from the cockpit, a stern crease between his brows. He stepped into the main aisle and addressed Jenna without dramatics. You'll remain on board until you're formally debriefed by the regional director. Jenna didn't argue. She just nodded once, feeling the shift in air pressure inside the cabin wasn't from altitude but consequence. She wasn't just grounded. She was unraveling. Meanwhile, inside Meridian's corporate office in Manhattan, the day had already turned sideways. The internal email hit inboxes like a ripple through glass unscheduled oversight briefing. 4:30 p.m. Mandatory. Executive attendance required. For most, that subject line was just another red flag in a week already stacked with tension. But for those who had been watching Amira Langston since her acquisition of controlling shares in Meridian Aviation, it was something more. A signal. The storm she flew in on had finally touched ground. At 4:27 p.m., the boardroom on the 39th floor was filled with executives who normally ran on confidence and caffeine. But today, they were subdued. Phones were silenced whispers, minimal. When Amira entered, she didn't smile. She didn't shake hands. She placed her binder at the head of the table, took her seat, and opened to the first page marked Policy, Passenger Equity, and Personnel Conduct. The incident on Flight 308 from Santa Barbara, she began, is not an anomaly. It is a symptom. A few board members shifted in their chairs. One cleared his throat, then thought better of it. For 6 years, Jenna Reed served this company. Amira continued. She completed trainings, passed evaluations, and yet in less than 5 minutes, she acted on bias so strong it bypassed every protocol we claim to uphold. She let the words breathe. This isn't about punishing one woman. It's about exposing the air we breathe in this organization. The air that tells some of us to watch our tone while others never even notice theirs. The room was dead quiet. I'm not interested in a press strategy, she said. I'm interested in rewriting our culture. A hand went up. Kevin Marsh, VP of Operations. Dr. Langston, with respect, this might escalate. If it leaks, it won't leak, she interrupted. Because we're not hiding it. We're documenting it, publishing it, and we're embedding it into every level of this company, from hiring to flight briefings to conflict de-escalation. Another executive, Elena Chow from HR, nodded slowly. Are you proposing a company-wide audit? I'm implementing it, Amira replied, and I'll oversee it personally. Outside, the skyline burned orange with early evening sun. Inside, something far more enduring had been lit. That night, Jenna Reed sat alone in a temporary office at JFK's regional admin building. No badge, no uniform, just a plain polo and khakis handed to her without ceremony. On the desk was a printed form, Voluntary Participation in Organizational Realignment Program. She stared at it unsigned. She didn't need to be told she was replaceable. What haunted her was the realization that she had been so certain, so sure of her right, to judge her power, to question her authority, to decide who belonged and who didn't. And all of it, every illusion, had been dismantled without Amira raising her voice. Redemption wasn't the form on the desk. It wasn't an apology emailed to HR. It was the slow, unglamorous work of becoming someone different from who she had been at 38,000 feet. That wasn't just corporate realignment. It was personal reckoning. Amira returned to her apartment just after 10 p.m. She peeled off her jacket, slipped into a sweatshirt, and sat on her terrace overlooking the East River. She didn't celebrate. There was no relief. Because for people like her, victories weren't celebrated. They were carried like quiet burdens with invisible weight. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mariah. Board approved full implementation. Congrats. She didn't respond. Instead, she stared out at the city lights and whispered to herself the truth she had learned long ago. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives in accountability, in systems rebuilt in silence, turned into change. And tonight, she had turned turbulence into transformation. In the weeks that followed, the media didn't find out. There were no viral headlines or dramatic exposés. Amira Langston had kept her word, no spin, no spectacle. But change, real change, rarely needs an audience. It just needs commitment. Inside Meridian Aviation's headquarters, silence had taken on a new tone. Not fear, not shame, something more reflective. Meetings grew shorter, words more measured. People began listening to each other not because they were told to, but because it had become impossible not to. Jenna Reed hadn't worn her uniform since the day they landed. She didn't know if she ever would again. Some mornings, she still reached for it out of habit, then stopped herself. It wasn't about losing the badge. It was about losing the version of herself that had once worn it without question. She reported every day to the realignment program in a modest training facility in Newark, where she sat through hours of footage, dialogue circles, and guest panels led by people who had lived the consequences of implicit bias firsthand. She didn't speak much at first. She listened. One afternoon, she found herself across from a former flight attendant who now led workshops in restorative accountability. You don't get to fix it, the woman said softly. You get to face it. That's different. Jenna didn't argue. She nodded, because for once that was enough. Each session pulled something apart inside her, revealing how deeply she had once mistaken protocol for principle certainty for wisdom. Amira kept her distance, not out of spite, but purpose. This wasn't her journey to micromanage. Redemption was never handed down from power. It was claimed by those who chose to walk through it with their own feet. Still, she received weekly reports. She saw Jenna's name on the completion rosters, read the notes about her reflections, the moments she'd chosen to own the ones she still wrestled with. And in those pages, Amira found something that mattered more than performance intent. Not performative remorse, but the slow rebuilding of a conscience. It would be easy to believe that Amira walked away from it untouched. But the truth is, people who carry stories like hers don't walk away. They integrate. They absorb. They carry the silence, the looks, the assumptions, and repurpose them into policy architecture structure, anything that ensures the next woman like her never has to fight the same battle. Months later, a new internal training series launched at Meridian. It was called The Seat Next to You. In one of the videos, Amira appeared briefly, not in a boardroom, not behind a podium, but sitting beside a younger employee on a plane, having a quiet, open conversation about presence and perception. You don't have to be a CEO to change how people are treated, she said. Sometimes it starts with how you greet them. Jenna watched that video on her last day in the program. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood a little taller, walked to the front of the room, and signed her name next to the words, "I acknowledge the journey. I continue it from here." Redemption didn't hand her back a uniform. It handed her a mirror, and this time she didn't look away. In a world where appearances are too often mistaken for truth, where assumptions speak louder than questions, the story of Amira Langston and Jenna Reed reminds us that true identity isn't always worn on the surface. It unfolds in actions, in grace, under pressure, and in the choices we make when no one expects us to lead. From the private tarmac in Los Angeles to a training room in Newark, this wasn't just a story about an incident on a jet. It was a quiet revolution that began with a slap and ended with a mirror held up to an entire system. Amira Langston didn't demand justice with volume. She delivered it with presence. A billionaire in worn sneakers, a quiet powerhouse who never needed to raise her voice to be heard. In the face of disrespect, she didn't retaliate, she responded. Not with punishment, but with policy. Not with vengeance, but with vision. She reminded everyone watching both on that plane and beyond that power doesn't need to scream. Sometimes it whispers through integrity. Jenna Reed's journey, however painful, was no less important. Because real growth never comes from comfort, it comes from confrontation. The kind that forces us to face what we didn't want to see in ourselves. She made a mistake, but more importantly, she stayed to face it. She sat in the silence she created, listened to the consequences she never imagined, and allowed herself to be transformed by truth. Not because she had to, but because she chose to. Their paths intersecting for just a few hours left an imprint that echoed far beyond a single flight. Company-wide reform, new equity training, cultural change not born out of PR damage control, but out of lived experience and accountability. This was the quiet power of impact. And it all began because one woman refused to be erased and another woman refused to stay blind. The lesson here isn't just about race or class or the silence between boarding and arrival. It's about awareness. It's about what we do with the moments we're given, especially the uncomfortable ones. This story asks us to examine how quickly we judge, how rarely we ask, and how often we confuse confidence with arrogance or simplicity with insignificance. In our daily lives, we pass people in airports, on subways, in offices, assuming their worth from their wardrobe or their tone. But what if we stopped? What if we paused long enough to listen to question our own lenses before defining someone else's story? That's where change begins. Not in sweeping declarations, but in the space between reaction and understanding. Whether you wear a uniform or not, whether you lead a company or stock its shelves, you have the power to see people fully clearly and with the kind of respect that doesn't ask for credentials first. And if you're watching this today, ask yourself, who have you dismissed without knowing their name? Who have you silenced by assuming their story? And what would change if you started every interaction with curiosity instead of conclusion? Let this story remind us all that redemption isn't always loud. It's often quiet, earned, not declared. And sometimes the most powerful transformation comes not when the world is watching, but when we finally begin watching ourselves. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see someone differently, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel, leave a comment with your thoughts, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. We're building a space where truth isn't just told, it's felt. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful, honest content that speaks to the soul of who we are and who we're becoming. Let's grow together. Change starts with stories, and you just heard one worth remembering.